Okay, it is 1 p.m. We'll call to order this meeting of the California Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board for Thursday, November 10th, 2022. The meeting is being conducted in a hybrid fashion with 3 members here in Sacramento, 2 members participating via Zoom. The meeting is also available on YouTube for viewers. We'll begin today's meeting with a roll call of members. The chair is present. Vice Chair Reeves.
Present.
Member Eng.
Present.
Member Allen.
Here.
Member Kent Monning.
Present.
Moving on to item number 2, approval of the minutes for our last meeting, which was October 26, 2022. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Okay, it's been moved that we adopt the minutes of October 26, 2022. We'll take a roll call vote. The chair votes aye. Member Reeves?
Aye.
Vice Chair Reeves? Member Eng?
Aye.
Member Allen?
Aye.
And Member Ken Monning?
Aye.
Okay, moving on. Let's show the minutes.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to make a comment about the minutes. And I noticed that when I review them every week, they do really capture the spirit and intent of the comments, and they're very helpful to follow up between meetings and prepare for the next meetings. I don't know who takes the minutes or prints them, but I wanted to just give a shout out to that person.
I think it's a group effort. I think our chief counsel and our chief executive and I think Mary Louise Warden all participate. Maybe Kristen does too. So everybody does a good job. So thank you, Mike, for those kind words.
Appreciation, because I do read the minutes after every meeting. Thank you.
Very good. And these minutes are then adopted unanimously. Moving on now to item number 3, the chair's report. Brief report today. In the time between our last meeting and today's meeting, the board has successfully reviewed 565 cases. That's a smaller number than we've been having, but there's only been 2 weeks since our last board meeting, so that accounts for the reduction in review. Actually, 565 is a large number for you all to have reviewed in just 2 weeks. For those who are viewing, want to make it clear that most of the board's work is done reviewing those cases between meetings. The meetings themselves are relatively brief and only give you kind of a glimpse of what work the board does. Also want to acknowledge that in our field offices, our administrative law judges have heard and reviewed thousands of cases since our last board meeting. Other announcement, just want to let y'all know that CUIAB is up and running again. It's been kind of on a sabbatical during the pandemic. The first webinar to be held will be this December, early December. There's not a definitive date and time yet, but it'll probably be the first week in December. And it will be titled, interesting title that you all may be interested in watching, Dealing with People You Can't Stand. So if you know some of those people, you may want to watch the webinar. All California appellate employees are invited to attend. California is, or will be, pending payment of dues, a state member, which covers everybody who works for CUIAB. So please feel free to watch that. We'll make sure everybody gets a notice of the date and time. That concludes the chair's report. We now move on to board members' reports with Vice Chair Dan Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not have a report this month.
Thank you, Dan. Member Eng.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing to report since the last meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen.
No report other than, once again, which I do at every meeting, to thank all levels of the organization, our judges in the field, our AO judges, all the support staff, IT, management staff. It takes a team to do the work we're doing for the people of California. And the only other thing I'd like to do, because I might forget it toward the end of the meeting, is to say that it's in gratitude that I serve with this board for the people of California, and I know we have Thanksgiving coming up. And absolutely gratitude for the people who have served in our armed forces who are honoring tomorrow for Veterans Day. That concludes my statement.
Thank you, Mike. Michael, moving on now to board member Kent Monning.
Thank you, Chair Block. No report, but I did just want to highlight and add on to what Michael said. The field offices this last month have closed 27,527 cases, and the numbers that we're seeing every month are so high. And I just commend everyone for continued hard work in the face of high volume of cases. So I wanted to just highlight that. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And that concludes board member reports for today. Moving on to item number 5. Item number 5 is public comment. Are any members of the public waiting to make comment?
Good afternoon, Chair Block. I do have one hand raised for public comment.
Okay, then before we go to public comment, let me read very quickly the ground rules. Public comment is limited to 5 minutes maximum per person. It is indeed a comment, not a dialogue, so there won't be questions and answers with the board. It will just be the member of the public making his or her comments for up to 5 minutes. If there is any follow-up needed, staff will follow up after the meeting as appropriate. With that, would the first member of the public wish to make comment introduce themselves?
Hi, my name is Tom Runge.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Go ahead. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. I put in a request for my hearing in March. My hearing still hasn't been scheduled. They haven't told me when that may happen. Is that a typical? I guess this isn't a dialogue, but I haven't been able to speak to anyone to find out why it takes so long. My finances have cratered through this whole process. I don't have money to pay my basic bills. I've received eviction notices. I just think it's I've never been fired from a job. I'm 52 years old. I've always put in, and I always thought that when a situation like this would arise, unemployment would be there for me, and it hasn't. And to expect the state of California to expect people to wait 8 months or more to even get a hearing, I find that like immoral. I'm at my desperate end, and I can't get an answer from the local office when I call. The woman who responds is incredibly rude. I'm just really surprised that this is, what has happened. It's very frustrating.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for informing us. What would you mind giving us your last name and spelling it for us? Someone will get in contact with you. Please spell your last name.
Sure. Excuse me. My last name is Runge, R-U-N-G-E.
And I don't want you to say your phone number over this public, but do you have a case number that is handy?
I don't.
I can get that.
Okay, well, just using your name, we should have. Just one more thing is, what city are you in?
Sacramento.
Sacramento. Okay, well, I promise you, someone from staff will get in touch with you this week. Well, actually, it's Thursday already, and tomorrow's a holiday. Someone will get in touch with you next week for sure. Okay, thank you for calling, Tom. Is there any other public comment?
No other hands raised for public comment, Chair Block.
Okay, thank you. Then we will move on to item number 6, which is report by our Chief ALJ and Executive Director, Mike Kutry. Mike?
Good afternoon, Chair Block and board members. I'm going to start with some field office updates, workload and timeliness, and get onto some of the other issues that the agency has been facing in the short time since the last meeting. As Member Kent Monning pointed out, the field disposed of 27,500 cases, a little over, in the last month. There's the last reported month, so that was October. That's necessary because our incoming monthly appeals continue to rise. Again, over 67% of the pre-pandemic levels. That is because the EDD continues processing its deferred workload, that is, issuing determinations that address eligibility as far back as 2020 and 2021. When they do that, we inevitably receive additional appeals. CUIAB continues to calendar its oldest appeals first. As a result, the 30 and 45-day time-lapse figures remain in the low single digits. Our average case age climbed from 108 days in September to 113 days in October, and that is a reflection of the continued high level of appeal transmittals and recent attrition and other impacts in the field offices. Still, we remain significantly ahead of the national case age average of over 218 days. That continues to rise much more than expected in comparison to California's. Recognizing that our monthly production and the impacts that have been placed upon us largely by items outside of our control, such as office closures and the like, we need to continue our plan to increase our production levels. So that's what we've been doing. So to that end, EDD and CUIAB met with the U.S. Department of Labor on Monday, our first in-person meeting with Department of Labor since the pandemic began. And we've set the roadmap for additional quarterly meetings to gauge our progress. EDD projects that its prior conclusion that its pandemic deferred workload would be concluded next month was off the mark. So they now anticipate that its deferred workload will not be completed until well into the next year. Combined with emerging economic factors on the horizon and the delay that is inevitably built into the appeal process from the determination timeline, we're projecting significant workload increases through 2023. So what we've done, we started a recruitment process for ALJs, a new recruitment for ALJs in the last few months, which is going exceedingly well. We continue to recruit ALJs and staff in appeals offices where the most help is needed. Our next ALJ training cohort is scheduled to begin December 3rd. That's led by supervising ALJ Katrina Morrison, a highly experienced ALJ and prior trainer from the San Diego Office of Appeals. Another cohort is scheduled to follow immediately thereafter on January 6th. As promised at the last meeting, to Member Eng, Mr. Silva will update the board on the tally of the new hires, including staff and ALJs. There have been a number of impacts in the short time since the last meeting on our field operations. At the last meeting, I reported that the Elihu Harris building downtown Oakland was closed on October 4th due to a bomb threat. And unfortunately, another threat occurred this week on Monday, November 7th. The emergency nature of those events and the prolonged closure of the office relative to the last time, we encountered significant impacts on daily office operations. Fortunately, the building opened without incident the next day, and those hearings that were impacted will be prioritized for new hearings. Up until this week, we've been very lucky with COVID impacts. They were continuing on a very significant downward trend for the last many months. However, this week we've had 3 closures to date. And a number of positive tests. Those are regularly tallied by Mr. Silva and his staff, and so he'll go into those a little bit. I've been reporting on our CAMS development. We're now live in Fresno, Oxnard, Orange County, and San Jose field offices. Our subject matter and IT teams have been pacing the rollout to test the system's capacity while addressing issues as they arise and fixing newly discovered issues as more offices come online. As a result of those issues, we've elected to take a brief pause to address some of the emerging issues, calendaring and system capacity that are more visible with more offices in the system. We're also using this time to implement many of the important suggestions provided by our end users, including the board. As it sits now, the next office to be rolled out is the Inland office in December. An important item in the state every year is the Our Promise campaign, and that is, I'd like to give a brief reminder to all of our employees. The next week kicks off that campaign. It's an opportunity for state employees through their state agencies to have an open enrollment for the employee to donate to a nonprofit of their choice. An invitation went out to all of the employees for the November 16th kickoff next week. We're always grateful for the opportunity to participate in this event, which provides additional support to Californians in their greatest need, and very proud of our employees' robust support for the program. Aside from the previous Oakland office building closure, which was not specific to CUIAB, I don't have any other security events to report. And that concludes my report for this meeting, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mike. We'll have questions and concerns for Director Kutry, beginning with Vice Chair Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, thanks for that report. Obviously, it's discouraging when people have to wait 3.5 months before their appeal is heard, and you just heard from that caller that in some cases it's far longer than that, which is not acceptable. But can you remind me, because I know we've taken a number of steps to mitigate that time delay internally, but can you remind me what the average case age is when we get that appeal from EDD? Because there's that problem that you don't appeal directly to us, you appeal to EDD, then takes that paperwork and then sends it to us. And there's a time delay in that process for which we cannot account for or do anything about. So what is the average age of a case when we receive it day one?
So right now, it's between 2 and 3 weeks. That obviously has some outliers. There are cases where we need to seek additional evidence from EDD before we proceed with the hearing. But right now, the average transmittal time is what we call that. That measures from appeal date to when we actually have it in our office.
Okay.
And that rotates or varies between about 2 and 3 weeks, depending on the week.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Reeves. Moving on now to Member Eng.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Kutry, again, thank you for making yourself available between meetings and providing very important updates. Just to follow up on Vice Chair, actually, I had a similar question. When we look at the metrics to see whether we are within DOL guidelines, is that 2 or 3 week in which EDD takes to send it to us? Is that factored into that into those figures or not?
Yes, it is. So we measure from appeal date to decision date. That we're bound by the DOL measurement guidelines, and that's what DOL wants us to report. So that is what drives our reporting: appeal date to decision date.
So let me rephrase it. So when it talks about average days to close an appeal or average days for pending cases, you're saying that when I read, let's just say, UI time-lapse appeals of 185 days, that includes the 2 or 3 weeks that it's with EDD?
Yes, it does.
So we are, I see. So we are responsible then for the EDD taking a certain period of time to give us the file, which we have no control over. I believe that was one of the reasons why we were thinking about having a direct communication from the claimant to our office, but we didn't put that in the regulations. I know we're going to get there later on, but just since we're on that point, what was the reason again that we withdrew the request to have the claimant directly contact us at the same time as EDD is contacted?
There were several, but one of the primary reasons was that we're rolling out a new system for case management, and we weren't in a position to absorb that at the present time. And so we agreed that might be appropriate to revisit at some point. But EDD is also embarking on a modernized system as well. To their credit, they have brought their transmittal time down significantly from where it was early in the pandemic. And when it arrives at the CUIAB, I'll be honest, we still have a huge workload to incorporate it into. So I hope that answers your question, but there were a number of factors in that discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And I think the main thing is that, as you said, we may need to revisit that at a certain point. So as long as someone's looking at it every month or every other month, I do think it was worthwhile proposal, and I'd hate to see it, permanently taken off the table. So you've answered the question. I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen. Member Allen, your mic is muted, I believe.
Absolutely correct. Thank you. So, Judge Kutry, the question I have for you, maybe you have the answer, maybe you don't, because it really concerns something with EDD. And I'm just wondering, does the EDD have a process set up for when we have mass layoffs in certain sectors of the economy? For instance, I know the the tech giants right now are going to be doing mass layoffs. Do they have a way of dealing with that in such a way as it's expedited so that it doesn't end up being on a case-by-case basis? Or is that going to have an impact on us?
The answer is a little bit unclear, but I can say in past economic events, EDD has been fairly expeditious in its processing of layoffs, pure layoffs, because there's generally a period of notice and there are other rules for the companies to follow for that to happen. It's when the economy impacts other types of positions that aren't mass layoffs, but they're sort of informal reductions in workforce. I have to say from experience, those tend to impact us more.
Thank you. Your report was very good. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Member Ken Monning.
Thank you, Chair Block. Just one clarifying question, Chief Kutry, if I'm remembering correctly. When a party receives a determination from EDD and they appeal, isn't EDD undergoing a redetermination process in some way instead of just serving a middle function to kick the appeal over to our agency, or is that very case by case?
No, they have a window provided by law where they can redetermine the case based on the information received in the appeal.
Okay, so
they do have that opportunity. That's baked in. Some of them are redetermined. Many of them are redetermined during certain periods of time. So that's an important function that they serve. What happens is we get the ones that are not redetermined and are still in dispute.
okay, so then just a direct appeal to us is a little more complex than in terms of the function that EDD is serving in a redetermination capacity. We could, just adding that, if I recalled that correctly, that they are doing a review of the case and sometimes resolving the issue before the appeal gets sent to our agency.
It's been a while since we talked about it as a group, but that's
Okay.
That's one of the main factors.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate all the questions from my fellow board members. I think in light of the member of the public who shared his experiences, and I think that helps us always remember what all of us are working so hard to try to accomplish, to try to expedite our process of these cases as much as we can, which we are seeing in the ongoing training of new ALJs and the hard work that everyone's doing and launching this new system with CAMS. So thank you to everyone for the hard work. That's all.
Thank you, Laura. With that, we will move on to item number 7 on our agenda, which is a report by presiding ALJ for appellate operations, Becky Bach.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to go over the numbers for appellate operations and the board, which is that DOL requires us to close 50% of our cases within 45 days. For the month of October, we closed 45% of our cases, and that brought our total for the year up so far to 32.4. So we're really making good traction on that. Also, we are to close 80% of our cases within 75 days. We are still comfortably meeting that number. And I will have you note that our case aging went down to 37.1, where the DOL requirement is 40 days. So that's very positive.
Very good. Thank you, Becky. And our year, of course, for measurement purposes, runs through March. So there is time to make the 50-day.
That's the goal. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, questions, comments for ALJ Bach, PJ Bach. We'll begin with Vice Chair Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Member Eng.
Other than my repeat comment from last month, which is, Becky, thank you so much for the instantaneous advice that you have given to at least the cases that I've been on. Many of them are cases which have a timeline or due date that day or the next day, and you've been extremely responsive. And also wanted to comment that I noticed that you are authoring several of the cases yourself, and that the cases that I've read that you've authored are very much a role model for me with their brevity, their clarity, and most important of all, I think you really reflect the mission of our agency, which is to really offer assistance to those that are disadvantaged to no fault of their own. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Ng.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen.
Judge Baca, I won't repeat all the positive things said by Member Ng because they're all true. I just want to thank you for your help with those of us who are CAMS impaired and helping us with that work as we slowly work our way through the new system. So your good humor and patience with us is much appreciated, and I look forward to my next training session with you, and thank you.
Thank you, Member Allen.
Thank you, Michael. Member Kent Monning.
Thank you, Chair Block. Just adding my thank yous. You're always there to help PJ Bach when I have questions about cases or CAMs, so I really appreciate it. And the speed with which you reply is shocking. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Kent Monning.
Thank you, Laura. And with that, we will move on to item number 8 in our agenda, which is a report by our CIO, Jeff Willoughby. Jefferson.
Good afternoon, Chair Block, members of the board. As mentioned in my last report, as more people use the CAM systems, we're getting additional requests for new functionality and ideas to improve the user interface, some coming from folks who are here in the room. And as a matter of fact, just since we last met, we've experienced some scheduling and document generation issues that are taking priority on those identified items. And that's going to cause us to reschedule, as Chief Kutry mentioned, our next field office, which would have been Los Angeles, and will now be inland in December. So this hopefully short pause will allow us to identify and solve the issues that we're currently seeing. The root cause has not yet been identified, but it seems to be tied to bringing on more case data as we onboard successive offices. So I'm glad to provide more detailed information offline if you have further questions about the details of the working parts of the system. And I'd like to reinforce that IT staff are working diligently with vendors, consultants, and other support staff to address this issue quickly. So that's my unfortunately not great report this month, but I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for that not great report. Questions or comments for CIO Willoughby? Begin with Vice Chair Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I will say, Jeff, I mean, I think we all knew that this was a possibility, and frankly, you had been moving through the offices with enormous speed. So I got to say, I'm not terribly disappointed in the report. I want to make sure that when we get this thing fully implemented, that all the bugs are worked out. And so I appreciate the fact that you guys are taking a step back and making sure those bugs are worked out before you roll it out for the final set of offices. So I would, again, it's important to stay focused on the details and the functionality of the program, making sure that works for all our ALJs. That's what's important, and I think that you're accomplishing that. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Reeves. Member Ng.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeff, from what I understand, CAM's role has been extremely successful. Any issues are predictable. I've been a party to several of the rollouts, and I can tell you that huge cost overruns, lack of support, and the inappropriate software and or hardware have been pretty standard, and I don't find that to be the case here. In fact, this role is kind of like a hit movie, which is I look forward to it playing near a location near me soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen.
Yes, thank you. Your report is good as always. Once again, I had a little trouble, technical difficulty, and your staff was able to get me straightened out right away. And just kind of following up on Member Reeves' comment. I mean, I think that the implementation has gone so well over time because the wisdom of doing it over time, slowly, site by site, is definitely the way to do it. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen organizations try to implement agency-wide and have a disaster. So to me, this is a small hiccup, and I appreciate the initial approach and all stages that have been going relatively smoothly, and I thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Member Kim Monning.
Thank you. So Chief Willoughby, I agree with my colleagues that now is the time to delay and put in the work to get the fixes in. I think it makes complete sense. I just had a question generally about the morale of the IT staff and the CAMS training team because they are working so hard. And when they receive feedback from people like me, that is just a list of things to be improved. And if that's what their day in, day out is all the time, I can imagine that that gets challenging. So how's everyone doing?
Well, we try to keep, stiff upper lips in that respect. But yeah, the staff are working nonstop to try and identify what's going on. And just casting back, Fresno went off swimmingly, and Oxnard was really good. So we're here at this point, and now we've seen something where we thought we might have observed an issue, then it became cause for concern, and now it's all hands on deck to try and mitigate and make sure the 4 offices that are running are going to continue to run in CAMS, and that's going to be a very good outcome at this particular point in time. But we are working a lot of hours to try and identify what's going on, right? And I think, honestly, again, not to be too sunshiny about the whole thing, like we're close. We understand where to look now, if nothing else.
Thank you. And huge thanks to your whole team because they've been working tirelessly. And then when you're dealing with system-wide issues, I'm sure it can get demoralizing. So thank you to the whole team.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Jeff, for the report. Moving on to item number 9, a report from Rob Silva, our Chief of Administrative Services.
Thank you, Chair Block. Good afternoon, members of the board. I'll start with a hiring update. In only the last couple of weeks since the previous board meeting, we've had a flurry of hiring activity. We have had 9 candidates for administrative law judge accept their formal job offers, all with start dates in time for the upcoming cohort training of December 3rd. We also have an additional 6 candidates in the name clearance process as well, so that maybe they'll be brought on board in time to join that cohort as well. Our current count of administrative law judges, we have 134 on staff. That's field operations and appellate operations, as well as a group of retired annuitant ALJs that are collectively working about 10 and a half position equivalents for ALJ. Again, we're going to hopefully soon be adding these aforementioned 15 ALJ candidates to CUIAB, as well as 5 to 10 more with the current recruitment that's going on. Not including this recruitment, we have brought aboard 13 ALJs in 2022. And as members will remember, there were several months in which we couldn't hire administrative law judges because of the classification change and the lack of an active list. In the year that we've so far, again, brought aboard these 13 ALJs, we have had 9 ALJ separations to counterbalance that. Moving to support staff, in addition to the 5 support staff that I mentioned at the last board meeting that we're going to start the week of October 31st, we have 4 more support staff, 2 of which are for appellate operations that have accepted formal job offers, and we also have 2 more in the name clearance process. During the last board meeting, there were some inquiries regarding attrition versus the hiring of support staff. So I looked at during the calendar year of 2022, including the promotions, we have hired 41 support staff statewide. However, during that same period, we've also had 31 separations for various reasons. While this is a net gain, that number of separations, while obviously out of our control, is concerning, and it's a lot higher than we would like. And again, our support staff recruitment continues ongoing because of these separations. This dovetails into our use of overtime in 2022, which was asked about last month as well. In 2022, we are expending a monthly average of 12 and a half position equivalents worth of overtime in our support staff. I mean, overtime has its pros, it has its cons. An obvious pro is that there's no ramp-up time for training for that type of work because the existing employees are already well-trained in their positions. Also, even with the majority of overtime being paid at premium time and a half, it's still a bit of a less expenditure to our department when compared to a new employee when you add in the benefit costs associated with an incoming employee. The con, obviously, is employee burnout. And there have been very, very minor reports of people having, working a lot of overtime in the field, being burned out. But again, it's all voluntary on their part, so they work overtime when they choose to do so. COVID update. I figured there would be 2 weeks between board meetings and I wouldn't have much to report. And it started off that way. We had 2 positive cases reported last week with employees that had been away from the office preceding that. And so there was no real workload office impact. And then this Tuesday came along and we've since had 3 office closures this week with 3 more cases reported, a total of 5 in this 2-week period. Last week, I reached out to, EDD has a safety unit that I communicate with daily almost. And I want to see whether they might have some insight from the California Department of Public Health or CalHR with regard to any statutory changes that might impact the workplace with the ending of the California's COVID state of emergency for this February. And they have not received any word as of yet of any specific expected changes. So we'll keep on top of that. Lastly, I also mentioned at the last board meeting that we had our annual Schedule 9 budget call letter request due for large ticket capitalized equipment and contracts for the 23-24 fiscal year. So I want to thank CIO Willoughby not only for his excellent report, but for his excellent report he provided to me for the Schedule 9 request. His staff provided everything to me in a timely way, and even though it was due November 15th, it was submitted 2 days ago. And that's my report. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rob. Moving now for questions or comments to Vice Chair Reeves.
Thank you, Rob, for that comprehensive report. I know that you guys are working at breakneck speed to bring in and recruit as many ALJs as possible so that we can work these time delays down as quickly as possible. And it's only been 2 weeks since our last board meeting, but in that time, there's been fairly significant economic data that has emerged. On the good positive side, the Federal Reserve Board is reporting lower than anticipated inflation rates. However, there have been, as Mr. Allen has referenced, several companies reporting mass layoffs, whether it's in the social media world, cryptocurrency world, or the software technology world. We have tens of thousands of Californians who are losing their jobs. Now, as Mr. Kutry mentioned, when you have mass layoffs, I don't anticipate there'll be a lot of appeals from that because I think those are easily processed by EDD. But then those layoffs have other consequences to the supporting industries around them, and that's where it becomes more complicated. So I go back to the forecasting of Department of Finance and your communications with the Department of Labor about our budget. Is there going to be any additional, I mean, I know it's probably too soon to ask, but any additional changes given that changes in the economic forecast?
Honestly, it is too early to ask. I mean, the Jan 6 budget is coming up, as you know, soon, and we won't really start discussions along those lines until into February. Well, probably in early March, to be frank, pending the May revised period.
But you're not inhibited in any way from hiring as many LJs as you need at this juncture.
That is,
I just want to ascertain, I want to make sure we're not restricted by our current budget forecasting for something that may already be outdated.
That is correct. We're not inhibited. We would like, with the current recruitment, to reach a level of 25 to come aboard. And as long as SALJ Morrison and the offices can take more, we'll keep hiring them within the confines of our current budget that was approved by the board. So we're not going to be thwarted from hiring within our current budget. We have the positions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Member Eng.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Silva, I wanted to thank you for your report last month in terms of your sensitivity to those communities where English is a second or third or fourth language, and the need to add to our language portfolio in terms of translators or interpreters. You had mentioned that, and I should have raised this last time, that 2 languages have been added to the requirement for vital documents. I just wanted to clarify what constitutes a vital document.
I didn't have the list in front of me right now, but it was
Or you can
5.
send it to me.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's our main unemployment insurance and disability insurance hearing information pamphlet, as well as 2 similar documents, one similar document for our tax hearings, as well as 2 other documents associated with rights to a board appeal and the board appeal notice itself. I'm pretty sure those are the 5 documents, but I can send you a list in case I missed one in my list.
Okay. My second question, I don't believe that it would be directed toward you, but I can be redirected to someone else. But we're seeing the percentage of pandemic or pool appeals go down, and I'm wondering, does this mean that the training will decrease for those areas? And also, I believe that the issue of reassessment, tax reassessments, is very refined and requires very specific knowledge. And so my second question is, do you recruit for those positions specifically, or is it just a generic recruitment and then they get trained, or is it you mainly rely in-house for that expertise?
Yeah, I'm happy to handle that. I'm working with Judge Morrison on the upcoming training materials. So we train the new ALJs on all of the types of cases that a first-year ALJ would be likely to hear. That includes training for the PUA cases. So even though it's on a downward trajectory, those are cases that are likely to be encountered by a first-year ALJ. Then there's a second phase of more advanced tax training on the employer status type cases that would be expected of a second or beyond year ALJ. So those typically come after the 6-month mark, so that they can start to get those cases with a mentor and start to build their proficiency there. And then, when times change a little bit and we can focus on some of our complex tax matters, EDD has not issued a lot of tax dispositions during the pandemic. Then we have a group of specialists who have already been trained to handle those. And we will additionally offer training in those specialized areas to our newer judges as well, once that becomes sort of a volume need.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question. Apologies to you, Chief Silva, for taking up your time for the question.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen.
So Rob, my question to you has to do with your report regarding the equivalent of 12 FTEs of overtime. Mm-hmm. Over how many people was that spread, and what classifications are we talking about?
So the classifications are, really quickly, I can name all of them. Legal support supervisor, program technician 3, management services technician, senior legal typist, office technician, and office assistant, which are our core support classes in both field and appellate operations. I don't have the number in front of me. I've been looking at names, but in a month, there will be, you could have as many as 40 to 50 people, sometimes in excess of 50 people working overtime to get to that 12 position equivalent average.
Yeah, well, I'm not being critical here because I do know that you noted it in your report about burnout, but I'll just point out that even when it's voluntary, it's not real healthy to be taking on that amount of overtime over time. Also, sometimes people start making financial decisions based upon a higher level of pay, and so it's, I'm not trying to be maternalistic or paternalistic here, but I get concerned when I hear about that level of overtime, even if it's voluntary. So to the degree that we can have more people doing the work and people being able to enjoy their home life and the rest of their lives, that would be good.
I agree. And they also have to balance the overtime with the actual interviewing and hiring of new employees.
Right.
That drives, yeah.
Anyway, Rob, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Member Ken Monning.
Thank you. No question. Just thank you, Chief Silva, for reporting back some of the questions that were raised last month and giving us a detailed report. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Now we move to 2 action items that are on today's agenda. They'll both be handled by Chief Counsel Woo-Sam. Our first item is number 10, revision to Board Policy Statement number 17 on telework. Mark.
Thank you, Chair Block, and good afternoon, members of the board. The first item is a revision of Board Policy number 17, which is the board's current telework policy. This was adopted in 2011 and was applicable only to appellate operations. By way of background, over the past several years, the state has been negotiating with the unions for essentially a statewide telework policy that all departments and agencies across the state would be required to adopt. So again, after several years, in October of last year, the state concluded its negotiations with the unions and came up with a model telework policy that it instructed all departments to comply with. And what that entailed is reviewing your operations and adopting a telework policy or revising a telework policy if you had one in place already, and many had emergency telework policies, as did this board. But it had to comply with each element of the state's master agreement. And to help the departments come up with those policies, they created the model policy, and they also required the departments to submit their draft telework policies in January of this year for their technical review. We created one, submitted it to the state through the Department of General Services for their technical review, and they approved it as being technically compliant with all of the state's requirements. Subsequent to that, we provided notice to the unions if they wish to meet and confer on the impact of this proposed new board telework policy. We did meet and confer with Unit 2 case. We reached out to our other primary union, SEIU, and although it initially indicated it wished to meet and confer on impact, it subsequently chose not to meet with us on it. We did have meetings with Unit 2, as I indicated, and in response to those meetings, we did modify some elements, or at least deferred some elements of the telework policy with regard to ALJs. Specifically, we proposed returning the administrative law judges back to the offices 2 days per week to conduct the types of duties and be available for in-person hearings that had been largely suspended during the pandemic. Following the meet and confer with Unit 2, we agreed to defer having them in the office 2 days a week and instead having them in the office at least 1 day per week, and the scheduling contingent on the staffing needs of each office and subject to the presiding judge's discretion. But they would be in the office, so we would always have coverage for administrative law judges to conduct in-person hearings, perform administrative work, and at times we get claimants, parties that are confused about their notices of hearing and just show up at the office. And so it's been helpful to have that capacity of the administrative law judges to be there on those days to handle those in-person hearings that weren't expected. So we concluded our meet and confer efforts with Unit 2. And at this time now, having gone through this process, we would propose that the board essentially strike, as you see in your board packet, the existing policy 17 and replace it with the new board policy 17, which is applicable to all classes of employees with the board. And I'm happy to address any questions the board would have.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Rather than go around the horn, so I'm not sure if people have questions or not. Just indicate, I'll make questions. Okay.
Thank you, Mark, for that presentation. So I'm curious as to we're basically transitioning to a new model of hearings, essentially. Is that right? If all our ALJs are going to be able to work from home, that would presume that we'd be doing telephonic or Zoom hearings. And if so, is it either one, both? How are we going to be moving forward as a body in terms of doing these hearings?
I think I understand the question. I think what I would do is sort of separate the issues of the telework policy and the board's choices on scheduling of hearings. So what the policy itself doesn't specify that the board will always conduct its hearings either telephonically or in person. What the policy does is express that at this time, the board's made a determination that these job classifications are able to work either primarily remotely, primarily in office, or a combination. I guess it's always a version of combination, but that would not prevent the board from making a decision that at a point in time it wishes to default schedule most or all of its hearings in person. That would require a redesignation of these positions that they're no longer eligible for telework if, for instance, all of the ALJs needed to be in the office every day to conduct hearings.
Okay, but if we adopt this policy, the default will be to have telephonic hearings for most of the appellants. Is that right?
Not quite. So currently, that is the board's default scheduling of telephonic hearings. But this policy doesn't either, it doesn't change it and it doesn't cement that. It's aside from it.
But as a practical impact, if an ALJ is working from home, they're not doing in-person hearings.
Right, other than the days that they're scheduled to be in
And
there.
then one day they have to be in the office, which is 20% of their work week, correct?
Yeah,
I mean, I just want to acknowledge that this has a pretty significant impact on the procedure in which we conduct hearings, unless we affirmatively adopt a policy with regards to scheduling hearings.
I think the policy itself doesn't impact the scheduling currently. It's essentially, part of this is to, along with the state's adoption of a statewide telework policy, part of that is compensation in the form of a stipend for types of costs that employees incur working from home, internet costs, printer costs. And so the telework policy goes kind of hand in hand with the state's agreement to compensate employees for types of costs that they incur at their home. And so to be eligible for that stipend, the employees have to have a telework agreement with their state employer, and the state employer has to have a policy which conforms with the state's requirements.
I'm sorry for asking 3 questions, but it's just so I understand, absent this policy, ALJs can still work from home?
Absent the policy,
They just don't get stipend? Is that significant something?
well, I mean, we run into the complication that currently CUIAB is operating under its emergency telework policy. If the board does not adopt a new policy, we will continue to operate under that emergency telework policy. But as part of the administration's directions, all departments, including CUIAB, must at some point come up with a permanent telework policy.
Okay, and one last question. The governor's announced that in February, the emergency acts will end. Will that include all these policies such as telecommuting, and therefore we want to have a policy adopted by February? Does it impact that telecommuting?
I think it could. It doesn't, it's not necessarily that the executive order itself doesn't legally operate to end CUIAB's emergency telework policy, but they're certainly related.
Okay, all right, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dan. Member A.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Lusam, I just wanted to be clear. So each agency has the opportunity to have its own telework policy.
That's
And there's no overarching mandate from the state as to our telework policy.
what the state has directed us to do, and part of this comes from government code, which expressed the state policy a couple decades ago, advising that the state will adopt telework agreements, but it hadn't really been, as a statewide matter, pursued. And so this was the multi-year effort by the Department of Human Resources and the Department of General Services to come up with this master agreement with the unions along the lines that they would agree to. And so to answer your question about a statewide policy, yes, the Department of General Services, in conjunction with CalHR, negotiated a master policy, and all of the departments of the state were required to adopt policies which are consistent with that master policy. They can modify it as they needed, depending on their own business operation needs and their public services, but what they had to adopt needed to be consistent with the state's governing principles and requirements.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen.
So I think most of my questions have been answered. I'm pretty familiar with these policies. I helped a couple of counties implement their teleworking policies, so I'm pretty familiar with the material. So basically, the way I read it is pretty much what you said. The state has a countywide policy, our statewide policy, and this policy is pretty much an agreement with the statewide policy with a few little variances, like such for the case folks. But in essence, it just gives us the authority to provide telework if it's agreed to and if it's appropriate with certain classifications, and that it's periodically reviewed. Is that kind of a correct reading of it?
I wish you had given the presentation. You did it much better than I did.
Thank you, Michael. Member Kenmon.
Thank you. I just have one clarifying question. I think if we're taking a vote today about the new policy, we also have a document that lists all the different positions and designations. And my understanding is that that process of designating the positions in our agency is separate and an internal process. Is that correct? It's not something that we're voting on?
Thank you. That the current list of positions is part of the policy.
Okay. So the two different documents that I have here are connected.
Correct.
And it's currently, it has all the positions and it says whether they're designated as telework compatible or not.
Right, at this
Okay.
point in time. And certainly if at a different point in time, the board determines that it's not compatible with the board's business needs, the board would act to change those designations. Now, having said that, the designations themselves don't speak to whether or not this is one day of telework, whether this is full-time telework. And the board may be aware that Unit 2 does have a pending grievance with various other state agencies about its request to work full-time telework. Other state agencies are requiring members of Unit 2 to be in the office 3 days per week. CUIAB is not part of that grievance.
Okay, that's clarifying. Thank you.
And one more clarifying point for me. So as I understand it, there are three interests we're trying to work with here. There's the interest of CalHR, which has provided a statewide model. There's the interest of the unions, which probably wouldn't like a 5-day a week in office policy, and then the interest of management, this board and you all. And what this policy is your best determination of a way to basically reach a compromise between those three that will work for our office. Is that pretty much it?
I think that's a fair representation.
Okay. Because I mean, I personally, I not sure if this is what Dan was getting with, but I like in-person hearings. I think there are a lot of advantages. But I don't think that's on the table right now, so.
Right, so there's nothing in this policy which would prevent the board at the next meeting or any subsequent meeting from deciding that it wishes to schedule by default in-person hearings. The board would not need to revise this policy if that were to occur.
But it would likely have pushback from case, I assume.
We'd certainly have a request to meet and confer on the impact of that change in processes.
Okay, thank you. Member Reeves?
That answers my question. So if we did follow up with a scheduling memo policy, we would more likely have to meet and confer on that change.
Right, that material change in working conditions would classically require a meet and confer prior to implementation, unless there were reasons why we could not defer the implementation.
Okay, with that, are there any more questions from board members? If not, does someone might want to make a motion to adopt board policy 17 on telework as presented?
I'd make the motion.
Okay, it's been moved. Let's have a second for this too, please. If there is one.
I second.
Okay, it's been moved by member Allen, seconded by member Ken Monning. We've had discussion. We'll do a roll call vote. The chair votes aye. Vice Chair Reeves.
Aye.
Member Eng.
Aye.
Member Allen.
Aye.
Member Ken Monning.
Aye.
Okay, please show this policy being adopted unanimously. We move on now to item number 11 on today's agenda, which is approval of proposed amendment to the California Code of Regulations, Title 22, Section 5000 et sec. Chief Counsel Wusan will be presenting.
Thank you, Chair Black. We saved the best for last, of course. And as the board will recall, we've gone through an extensive process revising our regulations. Subsequent to our last board meeting, we heard back from the Office of Administrative Law that had 30 days to review our proposed regulation changes. On the last couple days of that, they notified us that they found some areas which they felt needed changing prior to approval. So we engaged in a dialogue with the attorney that was reviewing the regulations. And what you see in the packet is the result of that dialogue. And we can talk about them, but we consider them generally pretty minor. The first is providing a definition of the administrative record. And that's in section 5000 subdivision B. The next change on page 11, you'll see are striking some words and substituting them regarding the administrative record and what records are provided in response to a request for the records. On page 14 of the packet, the attorney requested that we provide an additional reference to the government code provision governing electronic hearings under the Administrative Procedures Act. And then on page 19 of your packet, the attorney requested that we modify the language in subdivision N there to clarify or limit the scope of types of hearings that the board may conduct or a field ALJ may conduct that do not constitute hearings on the merits. And then we added in another reference on the bottom of page 19 to the confidentiality provisions in the unemployment insurance code. There's one more change on page 22. he asked that we provide a period after section 5066.1. So with those changes, we haven't been assured, but again, in collaboration with the reviewing attorney, he expressed his approval of these technical changes. If the board were to approve these, the process would be that we would put these changes out for a 15-day public comment period. And if we receive no public comment on that, what I would propose is for today, that the board approve these changes contingent that if we do receive comments during the 15-day period, we would bring those back to the board to consider. If we receive no comments during that 15-day period, and the board will recall that in our original 45-day public comment period, we received one set of comments on the last day. But if we receive no comments, that we would take the changes before you today and complete our rulemaking with OAL, providing it to them again for another 30-day review period, which again, as I've indicated, the reviewing attorney has expressed his approval of these changes. At that point, assuming OAL does approve those, we would file these with the Secretary of State. And because of the timing involved, they would likely become effective April 1st. So I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Probably the best way to proceed with this, which is not the way I proceed with the last item, is to have a motion and second first. And then once we have the policy on the table, have a discussion and then a vote. So first I'll ask for a motion to approve item 11, the proposed amendments to the Code of Regulations, contingent upon there being, they will go into effect contingent upon there being no comment in the commentary period. If there is a public comment, they'll come back to us. Is there such a motion to approve?
I'll make the motion.
Okay, Member Eng makes the motion. A second?
I'll second the motion.
Member Kent Monning seconds. Okay, now that there is a motion and a second, are there any questions or comments? We'll begin with Vice Chair Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I don't have any questions. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Dan. Member Eng?
No questions for me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Member Allen?
I have no questions either. Thank you very much for your work on this.
Thank you, Michael. Member Kent Monning?
No questions. Thanks also to the legal department for your work on this.
Thank you, Laura. With that, we have a motion and a second. We'll do a roll call vote. The chair votes aye. Vice Chair Reeves?
Aye.
Member Eng?
Aye.
Member Allen?
Aye.
And Member Kent Monning?
Aye.
Okay, please show the proposed amendments to the California Code of Regulations being adopted unanimously, contingent upon there being no public comment during the public comment period. And with that, I think we've completed our open session items for today. I see no closed session items. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we have no closed session items. In that case, since we won't see you until December, I wish everybody happy Thanksgiving, and we declare this meeting adjourned.